Hello and welcome to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke, an ongoing conversation about ideas and current events. Together we explore what is really true, and in the process, perhaps we'll develop an antiviral mindset. In a world of mental and spiritual decay, I'm Luke and...
I'm Mike.
And we're here to have a conversation. Welcome.
Welcome to you. Have a good day. We both came from the coast.
Yeah. Oregon coast. This is the time of year. It's not too hot. It's not too cold.
That part, yeah.
We've had a string of hot days that have persisted into what normally, our rains are getting started.
80s, yeah.
And so we were at the beach Saturday. You were there today.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite beach in Oregon?
No, we go up, all the way down to Bandon is my favorite one. But in this
For the
area,
Gulf?
Well, no, just from a beach because of the
okay.
rocks. The rocks that get kicked up there. So we were rock hunting on this one. So I did find a couple beaches that we found a lot of agates. And it's not even agate season. It was pretty cool.
What's agate season? Is that after the storms?
It's got to have some storms start coming, yeah.
My grandma growing up, she lived in Newport.
Yeah.
And she would take us out and we'd hunt for agates and I'd always get so bored.
Oh, really?
And she's like, I got three. And I was like, you're just looking at the ground, Grandma. Like, what are you doing?
The other thing we do is we try clam chowder wherever we go.
Oh, different ones.
Anytime they have clam chowder, and we try it. And so we actually had 2 new clam chowders on this trip.
Any standouts?
Oh yeah, the one in Cafe 235. We'll give a little plug for them here in Toledo. It's only on Saturdays, but it's the smoked salmon clam chowder. They make clam chowder on Friday nights.
Yeah.
And then they do a smoked salmon version. It was exceptional.
I thought you were going to say to die for, and then I was going to laugh.
No. It's a quality.
Growing up, my grandma and grandpa lived on the bay between Toledo and Newport.
Oh, okay,
and we would go quite a bit and visit. And he loved, so when he was, I don't know, when I was about 12 maybe, I don't remember how old I was when he quit smoking. He smoked for 40 years. And he became in love with food, right? And living right there, he knew the fishermen. So he'd go down, he'd buy a salmon off the dock.
Yes, yeah.
And then he'd be out there, he'd go into his orchard and pull off branches, and he would smoke it for hours, just sitting out there, nursing that fire.
Yes.
And man, people would come from far and wide to get some of that.
Yeah, I grew up on the ocean. I miss it.
All right, so you wanted to talk about Iran.
Yeah. So here's what I noticed. I just wanted to make a point and see if you think it's the case.
Okay.
You made a point a couple shows ago about some Soviet guy saying sometimes the lie is not to get away with it, but it's to rub in your face that they can.
Yes, right.
Right? It's a power play.
The lie is the point.
Which rings true, and it's also a devastating thing. It's incredibly sad that is a thing, right?
There's a saying, and it must be Solzhenitsyn, but I don't know. But it's basically, you're lying. We know you're lying. You know that we know that you're lying.
Yeah.
And we know that you know that we know that you're lying.
Yeah.
And so therefore, the lie becomes this ritual of humiliation.
Yes, humiliation.
That we are all putting up with what we know you're doing to us.
That's right.
Yeah.
So this 9/11 was on Monday.
Yeah.
And I saw that there was an announcement of the releasing of $6 billion to Iran.
Was it pallets of cash?
It wasn't
like it was
pallets.
last time?
It had been frozen assets.
Oh, it was their own money our banks were controlling.
Yeah, and so there's a history to it. But the point is that they actually did it at the end of the prior week. Mm-hmm. They announced it Monday. And in my reflection on that, and I thought that was odd.
Yeah.
But as I thought, you know what? This is exactly the thing you were saying.
Right.
This is a rub it in your face announcement on 9/11.
Right.
The day when we were attacked by, countries from that area. We're going to give them $6 billion. And then further, at the end of the day, which I didn't see till the next day, the Khomeini guy in Iran gives a speech on 9/11 about how America is weak. America has proven itself to be not a leader in the world, and da-da-da-da-da.
Right.
And we're not going to, because that money was released with quote-unquote line items about how it can be spent. And he said, forget it, we're going to spend it any way we want to.
However we want, yeah.
And I just thought the whole thing was a rub it in your face. It was one of those things, the story was released on Monday.
But purposefully on whose part? In other
on
words,
the American government's part.
right.
On the
So,
Biden
so that would
administration's
mean
part.
the Biden-Obama administration.
Or the Obama. That's what I think it is.
Well, Obama was famous for shifting
right.
America's strategy in the Middle East toward supporting Iran,
Yeah,
right?
that's
So in
right.
the past,
That's right.
Saudi Arabia and Iran have been at
I
odds
do
with
think
each other.
this is a long-standing interest of him. And I told you, I have in my notes Obama the Destroyer, and I'm probably not going to talk too much about it, but this is one of the pieces I've been thinking about. There seems to be a calculated and strategic desire to undermine our country and build up some other elements.
Yeah.
Purposely destroying, seeking destruction.
So it's
this
not. So you're
feels like
so
one of
you're
them.
saying it's not just a naive assumption that we need the
Exactly.
whole world to be at peace.
No.
And America needs to step back
Even
so
though it's
everybody can
presented
lead.
that way, in a sense, I don't think that at all.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think it's a radical action.
But so someone who's not naive, and I assume Obama's not naive, right? I
Yeah.
think he's quite intelligent.
Yeah.
He does then understand that if he removes America's power position in the world, he must have someone he's thinking is going to step in. Is it the EU? Is maybe China? I know there's a lot of Biden connections to China that are kind of shady.
When you say step in, or do you also, could it be fill the vacuum?
Yeah, if you're going to create a vacuum of power,
Yeah.
who's
Yeah.
going to fill it? And there must
Yeah.
be a strategy. You don't just take down America. I mean, maybe you do.
Yeah.
Right? Marxists are famous for saying we're going to just destroy the system and then
I mean,
from the ashes, but with no
EU,
real plan.
Yeah. So here's the dilemma, I think, with that question is when we say EU, I'm on board with when you say that, because what you really mean is the globalist agenda kind of thing. What's that summit they do? And
The World Economic Forum.
yeah, these kinds of things. But what I find interesting about that, and I'm in agreement with that, but what I think is interesting is that those people, they are still the West, right?
Okay.
It's not China. China is the ascendant power in the East.
Right.
So which one of those really has the capacity to rule the world? Because I think they both want to.
Right.
We have been ruling the world, and we're right now, it appears, on our way out as a country. But I don't think we ought to default and say that the World Economic Forum, are going to just be the people, because China may be able to complete that. I don't know. I don't know the answer.
That brings to mind the BRICS nations alliances
Yes,
that are
that's
growing.
right.
Which is,
That's right.
I don't know if they're dominated by China or not because I don't know enough about it. But for those who aren't
I
familiar,
thought it was India that was leading that.
well, it's Brazil, Russia, India, China, and I can't remember what the S is. But there's a coalition of maybe you'd say second world nations, right?
Yeah.
Who say we're kind of tired of the U.S. dollar running everything.
That's
We're
right.
gonna create our own trade
I
system.
saw somebody, I don't know if it was Tucker or somebody he had on, maybe it was somebody he had on, he said, if that happens, it will be devastating for America. He was just talking about not necessarily the global interest, but America in particular.
Right.
That the removal away from the dollar as, in a sense, the global currency will be devastating.
And I'm not an economist. I'm not super familiar
I
on
know,
why
me
that is.
neither.
My impression, though, is that we rely on the dollar being valuable to everybody so that our debt can become...
I think that's exactly what it is.
And so we've sort of put
that's
ourselves out over a
exactly-
ledge and
Yep.
said our debt
That's
is
what
kind
I
of
think.
holding us. But if the dollar collapses, now the debt drags
that's
us
what
down.
I think too.
Okay.
That's what I think too.
All right, so I wanted to I want to revisit a topic. So a couple weeks ago, we talked about the idea of it's just a theory, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking about this in terms of science and how Christians often will criticize what I would say called the hubris of science, or even the religion of science. Scientists or people love to use science, I think I would argue, and some of those people are scientists, love to use science as a way of explaining everything, right? That if you can't verify it through the scientific method, it's not true, which is itself not a scientific statement. It's a statement of philosophy, right?
That's right.
So
It's a belief statement.
and it's very clearly a belief system. And so what Christians have done, I've watched them do in reaction to that, is say about things like scientific theories that contradict the Bible, to say, well, it's just a theory. And so what we were saying the other time, it was, well, yeah, it's just a theory because science is just theories and observations. Like that's basically
All
what it is.
science.
Yeah. And
right.
and I would even say, and I don't know if I did that time, that anyone who says science proves, anyone who uses that phrase, it shows they don't understand science, because science never proves. It theorizes and it observes. Only math can prove, right? Okay. But the other thing about that is to say it's just a theory. We got a moth.
You
here.
know what this reminds me of? Do you remember the fly on pens?
Yeah. If it lands on my head, then it's not a good sign. Okay, so the other side of that is to say, if you're saying it's only a theory, this is what I said last time, what you're really saying is it's only science. And then I echoed in my head that idea, it's only science.
Say that again. If you say it's only a theory, that is syllogistically, it's only science.
Correct.
Because science, that's what they have.
And the accusation that we receive from people on the left, scientism, is to say, if you throw out science, you're anti-intellectual. Mm-hmm. And now we've kind of coined the term "the science." It's not science; it's the science.
Yeah, with a little trademark.
And it's Fauci, and it's all this stuff, and it's political science of all, most of all.
Yeah.
Okay, so part of the question was, or part of what I thought about, because my argument last time was, don't say it's just a theory, because then you're denigrating science. But the more I thought about it, was like, you know what? Why aren't we saying it's just science? Do you know what I mean?
I do.
Why are we letting science be the highest?
Yes.
The decider of moral.
When we give it the room to breathe like that, we're actually assuming the assumptions with the argument.
We're accepting the premise.
We're accepting the premise.
Yeah,
that's right.
That's right. And once you accept the premise, you're in a losing position every time.
I agree. I remember hearing the guys with abortion say, what if the baby that was aborted would have grown up to be the president of the United States?
Right.
Same issue. You're accepting the premise that its value is based on its accomplishment.
Right.
It's like, oh, don't say that. Yeah, you're right. I think that's right. The science is just science.
And that comes back to the age of the universe was recently doubled. Have you heard about this?
No, I haven't.
So the Hubble telescope was for the longest time the big, and now it's the James Webb telescope has replaced it. It's massively, it can see much farther and et cetera. And when they looked deep into space, that should be many billions of years in the past, right? If it's 13 billion light years, then the light has been traveling for 13 billion years to get here.
Yep.
Okay, so if the universe is just a little more than 13 billion years, you should see underdeveloped stars and solar systems when you look that far away. And they're all there. Galaxies are all in place. Everything exists out there as it does here. And so the whole Big Bang question sort of came into like, wait, whoa. We thought we had a beginning, right? Because we're watching an expanding universe, and so we should be able to subtract and cause and effect.
Yeah.
And as a Christian and other people have said, oh yeah, Big Bang, that kind of makes sense. God said, let there be light, and boom, there it was. And so you sort of can latch onto the science. Well, now it's all getting questioned. Even the Big Bang is to say, and yet this new observation actually is more biblical, that God would create the universe with galaxies and stars and planets that exist as they are.
So I would adjust that and say it's potentially just as biblical.
And it's just science. It's going to change.
Of age. Because there has been a long-standing argument that God created with an appearance of age. So Adam was not an infant. We know a couple things that this appears to have been true. If that is the accurate, if Adam was created like that he wasn't created as a baby, an infant, right?
Yeah.
So with the appearance of age argument, so it's possible that it doesn't violate a way of understanding Scripture. You know what I think is interesting about that, since you tied in Scripture, is one of the most fascinating times of scientific history, I guess, would be Galileo and the Copernican revolution, to where the sun is considered the center of our galaxy rather than the earth. And the pushback from the church was so substantial. And they would use verses like in the Psalms, the sun rises in the east, let's say. And say, see, the sun rises. We're not going around the sun is going around us.
Right.
And look, it's plain Scripture. Well, so the same way that you just said science is only theorizing, there could be a similar sense in which we say that it is our ongoing effort to understand Scripture as best we can. But we have to leave room for always being able and willing to revise if something comes along to force us into it.
The same way that scientists do.
The same way that scientists do. And that doesn't put it in the same category as saying that the Scriptures really can't be known if they're true or not. I don't think it does that. But it does treat it with a similar dynamic where when they came along and said, no, the sun can't be the center. Well, what I ended up learning is that, those verses don't have to be read to mean that. It can
be figures of speech and observational statements.
Yes, that's right. And so we can see how it is true from this vantage point, but it doesn't necessarily have to conclude what we thought it did before. And so leaving ourselves the flexibility to adjust when we find new information is a good thing.
Yeah.
It's absolutely required in science, and it's also profitable even with Scripture.
So I've watched some of the kind of creation science, Ken Ham and the Ark project where they built a life-size replica in Kentucky. A couple people were really hoping we'd visit when we went to Asbury, that we'd go down and see the Ark. It's supposed to be pretty amazing. But one of the cool things I've heard listening to those guys talk is that we know from other writings that are around the same time period as parts of the Bible, that there were tons of misconceptions about science, but that they just, even those misconceptions were probably accepted by biblical authors, but not put in the Bible overtly, right? And so you get something like the sun rising and say, okay, he's not making a statement, and this is the point I get to. He's not trying to make a statement about heliocentrism. He's not trying to make a scientific treatise. He's trying to make a point about God.
Yeah.
And when you look out there and you say, well, oh yeah, the sun moves up. That's the whole thing he's trying to say.
Yeah.
And so when people ask, do you take the Bible literally? I say, absolutely, in the literary sense. He's not literally trying to make an observation about science. He's trying to make an observation about God.
So to me, this is probably the most intriguing topic I've been thinking through, one of the top two in the last maybe 5 or 6 years, because it's extremely difficult and sensitive. So the illustration that I use is the windows of heaven, the pillars of the earth.
Okay.
The biblical authors believed scientifically, the science of the day was that rain, they lived under a dome.
Okay.
And that there were windows up in the heavens, and that the snow comes from them, the rain, and that God opened the windows.
So are you talking about from Job?
It's all over.
Okay.
The three-tiered, if you want to get even bigger than that, it's the three-tiered universe, the above the earth and below the earth.
Okay.
And so, and what's so interesting about that is that three-tiered universe goes on even quoted by Paul in Philippians, because while some scientific things had changed in their perceptions, the three-tier universe had not. And so in any case, what it's called is accommodationism, that when God communicated, and we all do it, linguistics talk about if you and I are going to talk, we do have some accommodating. Now, you and I share a lot of similarity, but in terms of our cultural background.
Right.
But the more dissimilarity we have, the more then we have to accommodate one another's understanding in order to even be able to communicate. The accommodation is never meant to be an approval of those things. And so what the difficulty is in Scripture, which things are God's accommodations? And so one of them, I think that is easy, which I believe, is this idea of the windows of heaven and the pillars of the earth. I don't think there really are. I don't think there ever were. I think they got it wrong.
So there's not a conspiracy, and this is something I've seen, is that there's a conspiracy about space. There's actually a conspiracy theory out there that space isn't real.
There's a flat Earth society still.
Yeah, but even a lot of the flat earthers will still believe that the planets are out there. So the guys who say there's no space literally say it's all of it, like NASA. No one's ever gone out there.
Yeah.
It's not out. There's nothing out there.
Yeah.
And that it is and I think it's probably adjacent to flat Earth.
Yeah.
It's the dome.
So I think I've made my peace with accommodationism from that perspective, but now we get into several other pieces too. Accommodation. So let's talk about something we've talked about.
Wait, before you dive into that, I have a question about it. So what you're saying is when the Bible talks about the windows of heaven, I would read that to be a figure of speech. But what you're saying is
they did not say it that way.
You don't think they understood it
They
to mean
didn't
that.
say it as a figure of speech.
Okay.
It was the science of their day.
And how do we verify that? Like, what's
Because
that
of
based on?
all the literature from the surrounding time period.
Okay.
Everybody, they all have it. This is their world. This is it's called the cognitive world.
Right.
The cognitive world in which the Old Testament is written. It's a large period of time, and you have to deal with the Babylonian one, the Egyptian one, the Canaanite one, and
so. But I keep thinking of Job, right?
Yeah.
Because when you go through Job, the part where it talks about the windows of heaven and all that is actually God speaking.
I know.
Right. So it's not as if it was just some guy out on his own trying to figure it out.
So one set of evangelical people would say, Well, no, they would never. When God speaks it, he is affirming its validity. Because, see, God wouldn't lie.
Right.
But I think that's a problem because I don't believe that God is trying to say that snow comes from the windows of heaven. I think he's accommodating the understanding Job has because that's a minimal point. In other words, the science, so to speak, is going to be an ongoing development of we, his children, and discovery. And whenever God stepped into history and spoke, he never said, so I just want to say, I'm going to come someday and it will look like I'm from another planet. And I know you don't know what planets mean, but someday you'll, he doesn't go into this
He
massive...
speaks their language.
He speaks their language with the terms they understand.
Yeah.
And we can't therefore conclude he gives his affirmation to the things he says.
Right. Okay.
So that comes up in a lot of areas. That comes up in what about spirits? There are evangelicals who said the Old Testament approach to spirits. We know now that that's not real.
Ah, right.
What about this? The Old Testament approach to homosexuality.
Yeah.
We know now that that was a shaming issue, not a sinful moral issue.
So you're saying where's the limits?
It becomes a slippery slope.
Yeah.
And the problem is if you say, I'm not going to be on the slope, you get into stupid land. You can't not be on the slope. But where you stop, it is really hard to know.
You get into
It's
stupid land
difficult.
because you start saying there are pillars holding up
You
the land.
have to believe in pillars.
Okay.
You have to, because God said it.
I listened to somebody talking about flat Earth. It was a guy
Yeah.
who was going to go through, and it was Mike Winger on the Bible Thinker is his
Yeah.
web podcast,
Yeah.
and he went through a series of verses that are used by flat earthers
Yeah.
to claim
Yeah.
the Bible believes the Earth is flat.
Yeah.
And he soundly refuted them all from the context of the verses themselves.
Okay.
That if you were reading to say that there are actually four corners of the earth,
Mm-hmm.
right, then even the verse within its context wouldn't make sense. It's a metaphor they're using.
It's
a
I
figure
would
of
probably
speech.
disagree with him, and here's why.
Yeah.
When the Earth was, when the idea of flat Earth was being overcome, there's all these arguments that were put up, and people started saying it's a globe, it's a sphere.
Okay.
So here were the arguments. If that was true, the people on the other side of the Earth would fall off.
Okay.
Totally relevant argument. If this is the Earth and there's people and we're on it, you're telling me it's a ball and there's people down there, they would fall off.
Right.
The argument is completely sound. Now we know it's not a true argument. The argument doesn't understand mass, it doesn't understand gravity and sphere, it doesn't all that we live with.
Yeah.
But just take the simple arguments, it totally makes sense. I think that's what he's doing when he says it's metaphor. He's making sense of it. It is not what the cognitive world was. They did not think it was metaphor. They all thought that.
Well, I found it pretty convincing, and I'll send it to you.
Yeah.
I'll go find it.
Yeah. I think that's importing our today into their yesterday's writing.
I hear what you're saying, and I think he did a pretty effective job at not doing that.
Another example would be, and I'm going to throw this out just for the fun of it so it'll come up later. We have to ask the question, what did God mean by Genesis 1 and 2 and 3? How, because of the fact that we find that story that we have in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, also told in all the other cognitive worlds, portions of it in different ways. But there are new pieces.
All right, you kind of lost me, though.
Okay, so here would be an example. No, I don't want to do it that way. Just because, no, what do I want to say?
What if we did this? What if
Mechanism, let's say this.
Okay.
We're interested in mechanism. How does something work?
Right.
We have watches, we have cell phones. How did it get put together? So what we want to know about how the earth got here, how? How did God make it?
Right.
What I think personally is that's not, Genesis 1 and 2 does not answer that question because the ancients never asked that question. They did not ask, how did God make the world? So I believe we misread Genesis 1
See, and
and
I reject that premise.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the simple
they
reason
asked,
that I don't
why
think
did
humans
God
have
make
ever
the world?
lived who didn't ask how.
No. They asked, why did God? They assumed it already exists. So for creation for them is not, for us, it is something that is not here and then here. For them, it is bringing order. So that's the whole idea of liminal spaces. That's the whole idea of the chaos and the sea. These are where God was not. Not that his presence wasn't present, but his creative acts had not yet conquered.
Yeah.
So for them, creation was bound up in bringing order to chaos. They assumed, along with all the cultures side by side with them, that what was had always been. They didn't ask, how did it get here? They asked, why is it here?
But
So anyway,
how can you know that?
because of the other, all the other literature that's found.
Yeah, I think maybe
The
there's definitely more of an emphasis. When you get into
Yeah.
ancient peoples, there's more of an emphasis on meaning, is what you're saying, right?
It's
But
not
the
just
idea
more.
that there are
Yeah.
humans who've ever lived that didn't ask how things work is, to me,
I didn't say how things
utterly
work,
impossible.
how it got here.
What's the difference? I mean, science isn't really asking how it got here. It's asking.
No, we want to know, we're mechanistic. We want to know how things work and how did this phone come into being? What are the pieces that put it together?
Right.
That's what's important to us. They didn't want to know that. They wanted to know.
Well, that's because they didn't
why-
have phones.
Well, we're illustrating with a phone.
I know, but if you said,
You
okay,
could take a tree.
no,
and
I
the
mean,
sky
what is
and
the
the
big
birds.
technology of an ancient person? Is probably metal.
Well,
That's probably
first
the biggest tech.
technology is brick. The first technology we see
Okay,
in the
but
is brick.
and they did some impressive things with bricks, right? But to say, how did we build this? I mean, we still don't even know how they built them. We go to Machu Picchu,
I know.
right, or the Egyptian pyramids. We have no clue how they did that,
Yeah.
and the guessing is endless.
Yeah.
So they must have had a mechanistic understanding of things in order to build that kind of stuff.
No, that's okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay. We'll have to come back to that one. That's a
Anyway,
deep one.
how did we get on? This was a long road.
It's
You're going
just
to
a
do
theory.
us a
It's just a
subscribe promo for us.
Okay. Yeah. So if
8
you're still
minutes
listening,
in,
8 minutes
16.
in, we're at 27 minutes. All right. If you're still listening, we do appreciate you guys, and we appreciate if you not only subscribe, if you haven't already, if you listen to this on a podcast platform, Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I'm told are the two big ones. Hit that subscribe. We actually have a few reviews. If you think we're doing a good job, throw a 5-star review. If you think maybe it's only a 4-star, job we're doing, just exaggerate. Put the 5 stars. That's fine. It's not lying. It's ethical. All right. Let's talk about. Can we talk about men's ministry?
Go.
All
What
right.
do you got in mind?
Well, so we had a Manly Beach Day for church this last weekend, and I wanted to read to you something because I struggled with, or I put a lot of thought into.
Was that literally the name of it?
That was literally called Manly Beach Day.
Manly Beach Day.
It's not like
MBD.
other beach days.
All right.
It's a Manly Beach Day.
Okay.
It was a little tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I've done my fair share, being in church for a long time, of men's activities. A lot of times it's overexertion and soreness as a result, a list of injuries. One time I remember in college, our church did a men's retreat with a huge mountain biking. It was like world-class mountain biking we have here in Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
And 25 guys decided to go, but half of them were on the Walmart mountain bikes that they bought, when they were long ago.
Yeah.
And so we had, I think somebody went to the hospital. We had major muscle pulls. We had broken bikes all over the place.
Yeah.
And I was just with like a handful of other college guys who loved to mountain bike. And so we had fun, right?
Yeah.
But we kind of got back and then sat there for an hour and nobody came back.
Yeah. They had
But-
made it.
Sometimes the men's church functions for men become a caricature, right?
Okay.
Of like, oh, this is what all men want. They want a macho display, right? Or we're going to get into that primal grunt, or maybe it'll go the other way and it'll be all about how men need to be domesticated, and it'll be more on the other side, right? That we need to resist the toxic masculinity, so to speak.
Yeah.
We had a little conversation. You had some thoughts about this. I'm curious where you land on that spectrum, or how you would if you were going to plan a men's day. Why do we even need ministry that's for men?
Well, this is an interesting question because it is something I've been thinking about. I continue to think it's on my notes for future topics. Virtue, we talked a little bit about femininity and masculinity, and I keep wrestling through with it. In fact, my wife and I just talked about this exact thing going to the coast yesterday. We were talking about, I was asking the question, does the physicality of maleness and femaleness, does it layer into the social, spiritual, emotional components of who we are, and even the gender developments of what we tend to think are things that one male would do or female would do, etc. And of course, living with the 80-20 split, this is just in general, right? There's always exceptions. And my first thought was, no, it doesn't, because, men, we have musculature and we have bigger bones. We're stronger physically.
Yeah.
But the reality is there are some tough women. There are a lot of women who are tough. There's a lot of women who are tougher than a lot of men. Now, they might not be able to lift up as heavy an object, but it does. We're talking, does strength, the physical thing we observe, translate into another dimension of reality? And I thought, well, maybe, kind of no.
What do you mean by that? Another dimension of reality?
Well, okay, so we have caricatures.
Are you saying,
of
does
men
it
and
matter?
women.
Does it matter that men are stronger? Should we
Does
emphasize
it mean
that?
something?
Okay.
Does it mean something about what they are to be?
Yeah.
Does
yeah,
it
yeah.
mean they're to be the strong one?
Right.
The ones who go to war and don't cry at the funeral, or whatever caricature you want to create.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Does it really mean those things legitimately, and are there some mistakes, but it's nevertheless a valid principle? And so my first thought was no, because that would mean men are the strong ones. But the truth is, women have a higher threshold of pain than men. That's been shown. But the also truth is, there's a lot of women that are tough.
Well,
They
I think
are tough.
combat is the right question.
But so it's a different question. Yeah. It's not. So then I thought, well, yes, also, because there's other applications in which that strength, it's just difficult. And so I guess where it leads me in my thinking is, there is something to masculinity as being unique. But, so that's the first thing I would say. I think there is something.
Yeah.
But the second thing I have when I think about it is, when I did have also occasion to be in church leadership, there was a constant effort. I began to notice what would happen if you pitched a men's ministry thing and you pitched it along certain masculine lines, you would get certain set of men to show up, but others wouldn't.
Yeah.
If you pitched it on another trajectory, then those other men would show up and the first ones didn't. And I thought, you know what? The goal is to pitch masculine ministry, men's ministry, in such a way that men in general want to become better men. And so
But in order to do that, you have to define what a better man is.
I know, and that's why I'm saying it's a difficult thing. Is
Yeah.
it the strength? Where does that take us when you talk about musculature and bone?
So here's where we landed, right?
Yeah.
And I was the impetus for a lot of this. But we wanted to talk about challenging each other. And I think war is one of the right metaphors to look at. Joshua is exhorted to be strong and courageous. And so what we talked about is the three metaphors that Paul uses to Timothy, as he mentors him in the ministry and in the faith. To be a good soldier, to be a good farmer, and to be a good athlete, right?
Yeah.
And there's different aspects of each. And so we said, as an athlete, you need to discipline yourself.
Yeah.
That you can perform at a high level when the going gets tough. As a farmer, you're cultivating and protecting and providing for the people in your life. And as a soldier, you're ready and willing to join a team of people who are going to wage spiritual war, right? And in particular, I think war is a good, a woman could be a farmer. A woman can definitely be an athlete. But there's something about fighting that we were made for, right? I don't know about you. I watched a little bit of UFC.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Well, no, I'm telling you, in a
world.
physiological sense, it's absolutely true that there's no, and it's true athletically across.
I don't.
No. What I'm saying is, in combat, you could take the highest performing women, say in the UFC.
Yeah.
And your everyday Joe, they would win a fight, right?
Yeah.
But you'd have to get that. They would have to be world-class athlete.
Right.
If you take even the subpar mediocre guys in the UFC, they would win against the women all day long.
Right.
And not only that, I don't know about you, I don't watch women's UFC. I skip over it.
I don't like
I can't take it.
those things.
There's something not right about it.
I agree with you.
But there's
I don't wanna
something
get in trouble for
beautiful
this,
about a man beating another man. There's something that's like, this is how we're supposed to be, to push yourself.
Yes.
So one of the things we talked about was that we're going to push each other. And I read them this story of this guy getting trained by Bruce Lee, and he was running, and he was like, Bruce, I can't run anymore. If I keep going, I'm going to die. And then Bruce Lee's response was, then die. And he just ran off. And the guy got so mad, he finished the run. And in conversation after, he said, look, you're going to put limits on yourself. That's all you do. And now you're going to put limits on your morality, your limits on your intellect, limits on everything. Stop making limits. There's plateaus, but you got to keep growing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so what's funny to me is I feel like because our culture is at war with masculinity, generally, we are often at war with ourselves, each of us, to say, am I doing this right? Am I doing this wrong? Because I feel the criticism from all around.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what we wanted to land on is those three metaphors to say, are you holding yourself to a high performance mindset? Are you cultivating in people in your life? And are you ready to wage war? Or are you just hiding in a corner from conflict, right?
Yeah.
And we did actually wrestle each other too. It was actually phenomenal. And I think this is actually a good evidence that we were on the right track. I don't know that it was exactly right, but we set up a circle in the sand, and we had everybody kind of stomp around it and make it a beat up area. Everybody stands around it in order from lightest to heaviest. And now we're about half teenagers and half men, older men. The oldest, I think, was 70, and he wanted to get in that wrestle. It was hilarious, right? And a little scary because I didn't want him to get hurt. But every one of those teenagers not only was like exuberant to get in there and wrestle, but they wanted to wrestle the dads. It was this unbridled and totally natural desire to push the limit of themselves to see if they could be tested against the men. And the men were to a man.
The dads or their dads?
The dads generally.
The dads. Okay.
Yeah. Because they didn't all have dads there.
Yeah.
And then the other side of it was the men were all pretty hesitant. It's been a while, right? I don't want to hurt myself, get a sore neck and all that stuff.
And there's more going on than that.
And this question of like, I used to be pretty fast. I'm not so much anymore, right? And will I measure up? Yeah. And so what happened was, because we started at the lightest two, they wrestle each other. And then it wasn't full on wrestling. It was like sumo. If you fall down, you're out. Yeah. Or if you're pushed out of the circle. Those are the two rules, right? And so it was best of 3 rounds, and then you switch. And the winner stays in. And so usually you're just rotating up the weight class because the heavier person always has the advantage.
Yeah.
And a couple of kids stayed in for multiples, right? I was on the lighter side of the dad brigade. And so it went from me to the next guy up was like 40 pounds heavier than me. He got me, right? We were tied, and then he just basically pushed me out. But what I saw was those men who were all standing over there, and I didn't make them commit. I said, no, just come stand on the circle. So we got it closed.
Yeah.
That by the time it got to them, they wanted to. It like awoke something in them. And so then at the end, we did all the dads versus non-dads. And the kids were super excited about that. And there was a couple of young husbands that don't have dads. And so they got to be on that side. And it was like a Royal Rumble. And everybody, to a man, was excited. In fact, probably a half dozen of them stayed, mostly teenagers, stayed when we all went back to the campfire and just kept going.
Yeah.
Well,
I understand what it is you're saying.
Yeah.
There's parts of it I don't like. There's parts of it I don't like.
Yeah.
And so even in your thing, so my reservation on the we're made for this, when you went on and said what it was for, I could agree more with it. But the war part, soldier. So the 3 things: soldier, farmer, and athlete, right? Athlete, I think that's a legitimate thing. Soldier, I also think it's legitimate because we're in a broken world, but it's not what God intended.
Tell me more.
He didn't intend for any man to kill another person.
Oh,
There
I
was
see.
never meant to be war. War is a devastation. It's sorrow and a grief.
And yet he trains our hands for war and our fingers for battle.
He trains
right?
us. Yes, that's right. So I'm saying that war is a recognizable element of manhood, but I have a caution about making it a virtue because it's a sorrow. Now, is it something that has to be done? Yeah, I think it does. And I'm not personally. I have a good friend who is a pacifist, and I just can't go there. But he has helped me to recognize the grief and sorrow. Let us not be people who parade war as a great thing. It is not.
Well, not only
it's athleticism that is in an arena that should never have been.
And I carry it more. I carry it beyond athleticism, although athletics carries a lot of parallels with war, in the sense that victory is where I see it. Victory and greatness of potential, potential realized, right?
Yeah.
And I think one of the biggest sins that we commit is to waste our potential. That God made us for something great, and we do instead mediocre things.
Yeah.
And so what I want to resist in myself is a separation from my body. So I think men often, the way we fail, or one of the ways, right? There's many ways, is that we become just separated from the physical body that God gave us. And so then we lose track of being strong, right? That kind of like, no, there's just something good about having a strong body that we can
Now,
do
do you
things
think
with.
you will, as your age gets bigger and bigger, do you think that will shift or adjust in your thinking?
Well, my hope, and this has been my ambition since the boys were born, is not just to keep up with them, right? But to persist with the grandkids. Yeah. It was actually fun during COVID for a long time. My dad and I, who's now in his mid-70s, were doing Zoom workouts. And we Zoomed together and then put a video on YouTube, a workout video, and we would do weights, him at his house and me at my house. And because what I've seen is the health benefits of older people, or of us as we get older, of especially muscle mass, it actually, in huge ways, doesn't just benefit your health, but your mental acuity as well. God made us mind and body. And so part of being a man, I think, and this isn't unique to men, but is to stay connected to that strength that he's given us.
Okay. How about illustration? Here's one of the ways I think about it. Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
You watched Lord of the Rings, right? You enjoyed it? Okay.
The greatest film trilogy of all time.
All right,
How
there we
about
go. Good. There's men in that, right? There's some men. Let's take
most of
Aragorn, Boromir, and Sam.
Boromir, Samwise.
Samwise Gamgee.
Yeah. Who is the greatest? Faramir.
No, not Faramir. I was going to say farmer. So Sam's a farmer. He's a gardener.
Yeah.
Right? War comes and he fights. At one point he picks up his skillets, right? I think he hits the troll with his skillet.
Yep.
So he's capable. He's capable of expressing his personhood in masculine forms that Boromir and Aragorn are familiar with and approve. But it's not where he's inclined.
Right.
It's not what he loves. He's actually a peaceful individual.
Yeah.
Gentle even, right? Would my thing that I don't like is if we were to take those three, athlete and soldiering, and those two are very connected, farmering, and we effectively lose sight of the farmering, and we make events and call it masculine that appeal to athletes and soldiers. As if there are not a lot of men who are fundamentally peaceful men.
Right.
It's not that they couldn't lift up a hand and slap at an ogre and carry the sword. I mean, Sam displays those things as they come about in the story, but it's not the way he's wired.
So
That's
I
not
think
masculinity.
I think the whole concept of the Hobbit is what you're saying, is illustrative of that.
It is the Hobbit itself. You're the Hobbit as a
Hobbit
group.
race. Yeah.
I agree with you.
What's interesting to me is the book The Hobbit illustrates, I think, it better in a sense that it portrays Frodo as someone peaceful Bilbo, you're right, from a peaceful land, who sort of shies away from risk.
Yes.
He wants everything to be how it's always been.
Yes.
Because it's comfortable, it's good.
Yeah.
And yet he wants something more. There's something in him, right?
Sure,
that tookish side of him is what they say.
Yeah.
And yet, at the end, when all the men, and this is what I think you're saying about the way war becomes so heartbreaking, is it became a war for greed.
Yes, that's correct.
And it was a war for greed that was wrapped in the language of heroism, but it wasn't heroic.
Yeah.
And Bilbo saw that, and he just walked away from it, essentially. Right? He put on the ring and walked off.
Yes, and I think what that tends to do, and I'll risk coming across as heretical, but because I agree that our culture is effeminate, and they're effeminizing men and masculinity, and toxic masculinity is a thing, and it obviously there are distortions, but it's a loss. The loss of manness is a bad thing. However, I also think when you emphasize athletics and war, of which I've not been at war, but been involved with athletics, lived in Alaska as a logging and fisherman. I mean, there's no more manly men than these people.
Yeah.
But what happens is you begin to cultivate something in you where Jesus says, if your enemy slaps you, turn the other cheek. If he wants your cloak and it's not his, not only give it to him, but give him your other one.
Right.
These dynamics become something that don't track with what you're cultivating about yourself. And I shouldn't say don't. I think is this. It becomes very difficult to have those virtues of meekness and gentleness and self-control that are every bit, I think, need to be qualified as masculine than the things that would make for good athletes and fighters.
Yeah. Well,
Right.
here's how I would think about it. Because what I think we risk if we do emphasize as the right biblical teaching that you're describing, if we're not careful, that what we then begin to see is cowardice veiled in virtue.
I agree with you.
And what
I think you are
I think
right.
the greatness
I think
of
that's
the
true.
teaching of Jesus and around meekness in particular is to say, I'm capable of great harm. And now I say, I'm going to love my neighbor, right?
I agree with you.
It's
I agree with that.
And it's like what we talked about last week, becoming the
restraint.
Dread Pirate Roberts,
Yes.
so that you can actually be the
Yes.
man who can rescue
Yeah.
the princess.
Yeah.
If you're just a farm boy, good luck,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And farmers traditionally they're the best warriors. But the other thing too
Did you
is
say farmers traditionally the best
are the
warriors?
best. They got strong hands. They know how to wield an axe when they need to.
Okay.
But
I was going to go the opposite direction with farmers.
the other thing
They
about
like things that grow.
well, yeah, they do, and that's why they have something
delight
to
in
protect.
in
And that's the
other
difference
things.
between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, because in The Hobbit, the war is something to be looked at with shame, but in The Lord of the Rings, this is a war worth fighting, even dying for, even sacrificially.
I agree
and as
with
you're
that.
describing, the greatest hero is actually the one who doesn't fight anything. He just sacrifices himself.
In that story, you would think Aragorn and Boromir are the two most masculine, and
Right.
yet Boromir shows himself to lack some things that Sam has.
Yeah, that's right.
And Sam lacked a lot of things from the very beginning that Boromir, right?
You keep saying Boromir, but I have to say Boromir.
That's fine. Boromir. That's probably right.
So the other side of that too is, and we talked about this.
Well, and my point though is we want so I didn't know that you came up with the idea of the beach. I probably never would have shared that I didn't like the manly beach phrasing.
That's all right.
But it's acting like everyone should be Boromir and of course Aragorn is the balance, right? He shares Sam
Yeah.
and he shares Boromir.
And they and in that story, they both revere, not as much Boromir, right? Because he falls. But everybody bows to Frodo in the end.
To Frodo and
Samwise.
and the other two. That's
right.
correct.
Because they were the greatest heroes.
But the point is that when we make an event, when we charge for masculinity, the way God, whatever it is he meant,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And we think he meant something and it's not the same as women. So when we charge at it, we have to draw Sams and Boromirs and Aragorns and farmers, soldiers, and athletes. All of them need to say, I'd like to do that.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Well, maybe. And this gets back to that niche marketing question that we talked about before.
Unless you do it
which is to say,
piecemeal.
you can't make something
You're
that
right.
pleases everybody.
You're right. You're right.
But so here was my last question.
Okay.
Let's see if I can retrieve it because it slipped.
This is called age.
The question was, what was it? No, we'll have to come back to it another time. All right. You wanted to talk about the Beatitudes. Actually, this could transition quickly into that.
Sure. Okay, here's my question on the Beatitudes. Are they universal or specific? Okay, blessed are the poor in spirit, for they shall enter the kingdom of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
That seems pretty universal, right?
Okay.
Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. That doesn't seem universal. That seems only if there's some context in which you're mourning.
Yeah.
Because if you have 10 people, you don't assume they're all mourning, right?
And so are we right when we say, well, maybe you should be mourning?
That is where I'm going to end up going.
Okay.
Are they all meant to be heard as universals? And therefore, everyone should be mourning. Everyone should be peacemaking. And if you're not, something's amiss. Because everyone should be poor in spirit. Everyone should be meek.
Yeah.
You can go through them. Or is there a mixture? So that's level one of that question. Goes right where, because if it is supposed to be all universal, then we have to start rethinking about what some of them mean.
And I think that's where we err.
Persecuted.
I think that's where we in the first world, maybe, I don't know, the wealthy West, we err because we want it to be about us even when it isn't, right? Blessed are the poor. Luke just says poor. and woe to those who are rich. So we're like, oh, actually, I really want to focus on Matthew because it's poor in spirit, and we can all see our own spiritual poverty. I don't know. I think that's an error. I think we need to look.
Well, wait. When you say an error, you're talking about that the Luke version.
I'm saying when we make it universal and say we should all see ourselves in each one of those, and if we don't, something's wrong.
You don't think they're universal at all.
No, I think he's actually saying
In Matthew?
I think even in Matthew, he's looking across the crowd and knowing things. He's looking at that mother and see that her son died a year ago.
Yeah, but wait a
She's
minute.
heartbroken.
Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven. I sure hope it's universal because I would like to be in the kingdom of heaven. And what I understand is I have to be poor in spirit in order to
see the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
Right. Perhaps. Just because he says those people will receive it doesn't mean no one else does.
What, say again, what do you mean?
If he says, blessed are the poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven, that doesn't mean that no one else gets the kingdom of heaven, but it does mean they do. Right?
I hear what you're saying.
So I think but here's an interesting way I've heard that, the Beatitudes, and it is as a story. So that from your poverty in spirit, you begin to mourn. You see your lack. And from your mourning, you are humbled and you begin to long and hunger and thirst for righteousness.
Yeah.
And from your hunger and thirst, and it goes through and you tell a story because it begins and ends with the same conclusion, right? Blessed are you when you're persecuted, when they say all kinds of evil things against you. For yours is the kingdom of heaven, just like the hungry or the poor in spirit receive the kingdom of heaven. And now you start again. And so you actually can see it as a progression. That doesn't mean you need to always be in mourning. But when you are, God hears you. He's with you.
Interesting. I'll have to think about that, not only progression, but the idea that none of them are universal. I'm going to have to go back and rethink through
I messed with your thing, huh?
No, my question was capable of stopping right there. That was the foundational thing. I had some other thoughts, but I'm going to hold, but they were building on other thoughts that I had.
On the universal nature of it.
Yes, on the universal
There's
nature
something
of
about the maybe I'm overstating because I'm quick to dismiss my upbringing sometimes, maybe too quick, as far as how I've heard sermons preached and now read them myself and think, I don't know if I'd read it that way. There's an arrogance of age as well as an arrogance of youth. But to say, like, is it universal? The advantage of that is you can always preach a sermon on it, right? And that sermon can always apply no matter who you're with.
And it had, especially Matthew's, Luke's is so surprisingly different.
Yeah.
The entire Sermon on the Mount portion of Luke has a different feel.
Well, it's a sermon on the plain, right?
There's a lot of differences.
Yeah.
And most scholars believe that Matthew or Mark, one of the two, it's split about 50-50, was written first.
Yeah.
And then Luke followed, and then John last. So it is very conceivable that John sees what the other two have written. Luke, as Paul's companion, gathering information. He's seen these two witnesses, Mark, of which of course Peter's writing, and then Matthew. And he wants to make a different contribution that fills in some holes and gaps and makes some different points of emphasis.
Yeah.
So that's understandable. But Matthew's, and the most common perspective of Matthew's is that it's the king, and he's laying out, this is what my kingdom is like, which is pretty universal.
Yeah.
So it feels universal from the outset, and the whole Sermon on the Mount, so to speak, all the way Matthew 5, 6, and 7 seems to be, look, this is what's good for everybody.
Yeah.
Praying, when you pray, do this. When you forgive, when you have this, when your eye sees this, when you've heard it said to you this, but I say to you instead, all of it feels like it's for everybody.
Yeah.
And so...
well, here's how I might universalize it. It reminds me of a teaching technique. One time they asked me to go to Africa and teach their curriculum on preparing sermons. And I'm not a trained preacher, but I'm a trained teacher, right? So I took it with a very much lesson planning mentality.
Yeah.
And I learned a ton in the process.
Yeah.
One of the techniques we talked about was the maybe you, I called it. When you're hitting that application part of the sermon, you have a list and you say, well, maybe you are the person who's like the seed that fell on the soil, or maybe you are the person who's the seed that fell on the path. And you go through, you're not trying to apply each one to everybody, but everybody's going to find themselves in there somewhere.
Yeah.
I could see it that way too.
Yeah.
How does
All
that
right.
connect to emotions? Because you were talking about neutral or buried.
Well, we've had this conversation before. You had said you thought emotions are neutral, and I had said I never thought of it that way. I've thought of them
Morally
as
neutral.
morally neutral.
Yeah.
And I had I liked that philosophically, but I felt I couldn't go there because biblically it seems to say that some emotions, this anger is wrong, or this jealousy is wrong, or whatever. So there's things to don't feel this way,
Yeah.
because this is a sin.
Yep.
And so then I thought, philosophically I can start with you, and I like the idea, but biblically the verses say this. So here was my question.
Well, fear and jealousy are the two that I've found in particular. I couldn't find any others. Anger is cautioned, right? And then sadness and others, the Bible's not a compendium of
Well,
emotion.
anger is not, it's more than caution. If you are angry with your brother, you commit murder.
Well, if you are angry without just cause, right?
Yeah, but
Yes.
it's still anger. So
But it's
you have
also
an emotion.
If it can say in your anger do not sin, then it's possible that
I
anger
agree.
isn't sinful.
So there's anger that's not sinful, but it's also anger that is.
Right.
It's
That's the
murder.
caution that I'm saying. Is just because you're
Okay,
angry
you're right,
doesn't
you're
mean
right.
it's just.
There's a caution in that sense.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah.
It's still, I guess my point would have been that it's still, one is a sin. So
There's a
not
type of anger
neutral.
that's sinful.
Anger is not, in one sense, my argument would be that it's not a neutral thing. It's a right or a wrong.
Well, and
It can be either
here's
one.
the reason that I make that hard statement about moral neutrality of emotion is that, like, I've had kids come to me or young men who say, I was taught in church growing up that anger, there's
Yeah, you
no
should
good
never-
reason to be
I know,
angry.
I know,
right?
and that's wrong.
And I myself have heard tons of sermons saying emotions just aren't healthy or
Yeah.
not healthy. It's not they aren't healthy. They
Yeah.
don't matter.
Yeah.
And I can see where they're saying, you need to
Yes,
make your
that's-
decisions not
yeah.
on emotion or whatever.
Yep. I agree with
They
you.
definitely matter,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so there's this soup, and maybe this is some of that masculine feminine question that's gone too far, is to say because the useful thing, you watch someone be overwhelmed with emotion when it's time to actually get something done, and you think they need to get it under control. But if they turn it off forever, you also see someone who's turned their emotions off, and now they can't turn them back on.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
there's a time and a place for both, right?
Yeah. So what I was wondering is the question has a fault in it, and that is if you go to, so let's take the anger thing, right? Be angry and don't sin. So there's an anger that's not sinning. If you say you fool or you express anger, or the one I like is you're driving on the road and somebody cuts you off and you say idiot. You have committed murder, and if you begin to reflect upon what your idiot meant, it is a disposition of murder. Even if you wouldn't want to shed blood with your hands,
Yeah.
you have the spirit of it in the moment.
It's
right?
where murder begins.
It's where murder begins. That's
Yeah.
right. And so it's wrong. And so what I was wondering is if what we're really getting at is the things behind emotions that we can't see.
Yeah, that's right.
And so what that gets, and what I think is a truth is that we are layered people. And we have a conscious layer and we do have an unconscious layer. And I think that there is, within those two layers, there can be things that are 3 and 4 deep. And I think that sometimes God says, I'm judging you based on what you do. He doesn't address anything else. What you do, right?
Right.
It was Forrest Gump, stupid is as stupid does.
Yeah.
And yet other times he says, probe your heart to the reasons you do them.
That's right.
What is underneath. But then it gets even below that. So when the whole debate about free choice gets into why you choose, there is a level of motivation that we can't get to as people. I can't observe it myself. I can't get it to you. Why do we sit here? Why do I hold this? Why do I play with a pen when we're doing it? In a sense, we all make these free acts, but we're also driven by the deepest desires that are below them, and we can't see those desires. They're opaque to us. Maybe a few of them we see, they peek up and we can see it clearly here and there.
Yeah.
And so I wondered if this question about the neutrality is if there could, because I really like the idea that emotions are neutral. I just can't go there because the Bible says this sin, this anger is okay and that one is wrong. That's not very neutral.
Yeah.
But if the question really was that there are things that drive us that we can't see, and it's what you do is right or wrong, and then maybe there's a way forward in the question so that there is a neutrality. But half of it's because we can't really see all the stuff underneath us. We can't see motives. We can't get behind everything to get to the place where now we know where the neutral pieces are.
Well, and part of that, so this is an interesting question. I've had these conversations with dads about shame, right? Because Jesus puts this incredibly high bar to the point where if you were to really focus on it, you could criticize yourself all day, every day. Between lust and murder, those two commands in particular in the Sermon on the Mount, those two. You could endlessly
and there's more on anger in the Bible
yourself.
Than there is on lust, to be honest.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So I don't want shame is biblical, right?
Yeah.
We should feel ashamed. There's the right time for that.
Yeah.
But it's also overwhelming. You can get overdosed on it.
That's right.
Some people even get this weird fixation of it, right? That they can't
like
let
drug.
it go. Yeah.
It's atonement is what it
is.
is.
So what I think about, the way I teach about emotions is not that like anger is not wrong, but you can be angry for the wrong reason. All your emotions display what's really in your heart, what you really believe.
When you let's take that sentence for the wrong reason. What you did is you said anger is not wrong, and then you said, but it can be with this other thing underneath.
That's the deeper thing,
and that's the problem is with that is the difficulty with it is we keep doing it. It's a regression, the whole infinite regression.
Until you're just staring at the dark mystery.
So the reality is this layered idea is something that has a little bit of insight and a little bit of mystery.
So here's the question, because a lot of Christian ministry becomes therapeutic introspection, right?
I know, it does.
Where you're trying to dig into your own heart to figure out how murder got in there.
That's right, exactly.
But I don't know that the Bible more like says there's murder in your heart, now look up.
So that's what I'm trying to get at. This whole infinite regression idea, I think somehow the answer is there, and then the answer is say, look, if that's what it is, stop worrying about it. Don't do the wrong things.
Yeah.
Don't murder. Oh, you murdered? Go to God.
And that's where, who will free us from this body of death, right? And in the end, it's just Christ Jesus our Lord.
Yeah, I agree.
I keep thinking about that. I was thinking about this the other day too. This idea of the personification of sin. That sin is not just an act, right? It's to err or to miss the mark. And so you think, oh, it's like a performance issue. I'm not performing at a high enough level, right? But it's also, sin is crouching at your door. It has this evil intent. And that's from the very beginning, right? What is that, Genesis 4? When God says to Cain. And then I read Romans 7, and he's in the present tense talking about how I do the thing I don't want to do. And if that's the case, then it's not even me anymore. It's sin, this personified evil is at work in me. And that, I think, is the same question. How did this murder get in my heart? How did this adultery get in there? It's not me. It's something in me at work to destroy me. And now I throw myself at the mercy of God.
And so there's a little bit of recognizing it, and then a little bit of go to God.
He doesn't spend too long on it, right?
I know.
Chapter 7 has to go into chapter 8. And now suddenly we're redeemed. But what I see in that is a total commitment to the miraculous transforming power of the gospel. And then I go to church and I think, I'm not seeing the miracles, right? Or I look in my own heart and I say, I'm struggling with that same thing. When's the miracle coming? And I think what I'm missing more than I even realized until right now, is that God has designed this thing for us to have to wait for him. And have to go to him in longing, in need, and in desperation, like a person poor in spirit, and say, I have nowhere else to go. Right? And that's what real prayer is.
Wretched man.
Oh, wretched man that I am. Yeah.
Well, the Puritans would add another ingredient to layer to what you just said. John Owen, in particular, they call it mortification of sin. Have you heard mortification?
I've heard of this. Yeah. So tell me about these Puritans. They get a bad rap, is what I understand.
Yeah, that's true. Romans 8. If you by the Spirit put to death the deeds of the flesh.
Right.
So what they taught is the same dynamic, but they taught then that thanks be to God that you have to look to Jesus. You have to look to there is no condemnation. But then you also have to take up your knife and kill the stuff in you.
Jesus said, "Cut the hand off.
You have to
gouge
cut
out
them
the
off.
eye."
You have to do those things.
So does that mean when the
to death in
worldly
Jesus'
music
flesh.
is tempting you, you break all your CDs?
Are you referencing our earlier conversation?
Trash your computer.
Did
when
we talk about this?
No.
I must.
I
have
feel like
talked about
every
another-
youth group kid has that experience.
Okay, well,
I had some
I
classic
did.
record albums that I got rid of.
Okay, so here's my take on that.
I'm undecided on
When
whether
I became a Christian, it wasn't growing up in church, and it wasn't the sinner's prayer. It was when I came to the end of myself in college, because I had exhausted all my. I was worn out, and anyway. I give up. This is my sinner's prayer. Was I give up.
Yep.
Right. I'll do whatever you want. The worst thing I could think of is I said, I'll go be a missionary in Africa if you want me to.
There you go. Let's do it.
And so at that point, the battlefront, I only had 3 things of interest to me. I've said it enough public. I'm sitting here waiting to do I say this in a recorded version. But to not swear, to not do drugs, and to not get involved with girls.
Yeah.
That was it. Those
You've said
3
that
things.
on the podcast before.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, good. And in the process of doing that, I had no thought about music whatsoever, right? It wasn't, I was listening to horrible music. And I transferred to a Christian college, and I had people talk to me. They were so upset with me. Half the dorm was upset with me. Because
you're blasting it.
I'm blasting
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And I'm driving an IROC. It's a great car. And
Dwight Schrute.
it was pure.
What color was it?
Black.
Oh.
Black IROC.
So
T-top.
is this what like the kit car was?
No, that was a Firebird.
Okay. I think they're the same, but I'm sure I'm wrong on some level.
No. An IROC is a Z28 that was the international race championship. It is an awesome car. Anyway, I had dreams about that car for almost 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. But anyway, music. So it's a year until I realize this music is saying things and promoting a way of thinking about things that is not helpful to me. I need to not do this. And so I got rid of everything.
Yeah.
And it was the right thing to do.
Yep.
It was years later, I heard some of the songs on the radio. I used to listen to that. Well, I had become a fundamentally different person.
Yeah.
It did not mean that to me anymore.
It didn't echo in your heart the same way.
It was just a memory. It didn't echo and drive a spirit in me of thought, right?
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden I thought, oh, that's kind of cool. I remember that. And some of them are still pretty disgusting lyrics. And it's like,
You know what's funny?
and so I started listening to it again. And it's not really a stumbling block.
Right.
But it was right for me to get rid of it when I did.
in that time.
It would
Yeah.
have been disobedient if I hadn't.
Sometimes I listen to some of those classic rock songs and I actually listen to the lyrics because you feel this innocence because you were younger, you were more
right.
innocent.
That's right.
You know, now as adults, we look at pop music and we think, oh my gosh, how are they saying this stuff, right?
I
And
know.
the kids say to us, like, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
Exactly the way we said it back
Yeah,
then.
that's right.
But I've actually gone back and looked lyric to lyric and I'm like, it's pretty raunchy back then too.
It was.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that changes is when you're a kid, say this for a 16-year-old, when you're 16 years old, you think you know what sex is. You haven't got a clue. You may know biology, but
Yeah.
you don't really know what this big
You don't know the power that
thing
you're
is.
playing with either.
You don't know the power you're playing with. And so you traipse through it promiscuously for whatever season, and you still don't even know it. And then let's say you do become a Christian and you become an adult, and now you have this tremendous thing that is a part of your life, and it means a lot more. And you import that back into the words.
Yeah.
And you say, oh my goodness, my kids shouldn't be listening to that.
Yeah.
When, it isn't helpful, but also they have no clue what it is.
It's sort of like when you go back and watch movies and they have innuendo, and as a kid you didn't even get it.
Yeah,
you know what I'm
that's
saying?
right.
It's like
That's
that too.
right.
I agree.
All right, psychedelics. One more thing.
Well, okay.
You've
So
had
psychedelics
this
is
your
not only
couple
on the
of-
rise. Yeah. There's a lot of people in popular culture promoting it. Joe Rogan and his podcast, I think, maybe most famously. But Oregon is now
For
taking
certain
further.
specific reasons, right?
Well, for I think
Expand the mind.
spiritual reasons is
Yeah.
what I would say.
Yeah.
But what my concern is, and I don't hear a lot of people echoing it, is the Bible is very specific about the use of
Psychotropic.
drugs for spiritual purposes, right?
Yep.
And
Pharmaca.
and I don't see a lot of Christians speaking out about it. And so I just think we need to. And Oregon is sort of leading the charge down this road of even promoting
Now,
it more and more.
just to be clear, you're not talking about pharmaceuticals. You're talking about psychedelics.
Psychedelics, and
Because
I mean,
there is a movement that says
doctors
all
are getting
drugs-
involved in it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and to say all drugs about anything is silly, I think.
Yeah.
But part of the reason is there's actually under controlled, right, circumstances, they're seeing a lot of legitimate improvement in mental health
In
issues.
certain things, yeah.
Using
I've seen that.
not exclusively using psychedelics, but like just people who want to quit smoking. It's like this huge number of people will quit. People with suicidal ideations, it changes everything, right? And so you're seeing these big gains, but what they're not talking about is the cost.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the fascinating things, because there's now a bunch more
What do you
research.
think the cost is?
Well, that's what I was going to say. One of the fascinating things, there's a lot of research going on in Europe and the US around it, and actually using it in clinical trials because it's been restricted for so long because the federal government, right, had a war on drugs. But in their research, what they're finding is people coming out of these trips are saying, I talked to this being
that's
and it
exactly
told me, it taught me. The being came and said, I want to teach you.
Yeah.
And what they're finding is people all around the world are hearing the same teachings from the same beings.
Yeah.
And what I've even heard more of is that depending on what drug you take, right, whether it's psilocybin or it's DMT or some of the others, you'll talk to different beings, right? So the different drugs, and they almost say this drug is the drug for this being. And there's actually a link I learned about this week to the Salem witch trials, and some of the witch stuff that was going on back then was there were psychedelics highly involved. So they were hallucinating events of flying and being a witch and sacrificing. None of them were happening. They were just on drugs. They were putting these ointments on that they thought were medicinal, and in fact was because the women were confessing to doing these witchcraft, these dark occult practices. But in fact, under observation, they didn't do them. They just fell asleep.
Interesting.
Okay, at any rate, what are the teachings that these beings are bringing? And this is where the Bible has a ton to say. If you track it, it's basic Gnosticism. It's teaching secret knowledge. There's a now growing amount of links between it and the almost cult-like environmental obsession with climate change and a global government. That these beings are saying, you're going to destroy the earth, climate change is the top priority, and you need to have one government. And it's like the elitist agenda that we talk about in some way is coming from this psychedelic drug use. And historically and biblically, it's also linked to satanic, occult summoning of dark spirits
yeah.
to give you power and insight. And so, but at the same time, I've talked to Christians who say, "Oh yeah, I met Jesus when I did it," and I thought, which Jesus was it?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So I'm highly alarmed.
You're right. I think you're right, and I think you're actually. It's prudent to highlight the things being said, because I wasn't going to go there as soon as you started going in the direction I saw where you're going. I was going to go as a gateway, not a gateway. I don't want to use that word, as a doorway.
There it is. Yeah.
Into the realm of dark spirits,
right?
Of fallen beings that are malicious. They do not have humanity's best interest at heart. There is another world. It's a real world.
Yeah.
And God says we interact with it, and we have to even war with it, which is incidentally one of the positive expressions of war in Scripture.
That's right. Yeah.
But it is not one to play with, and it is not one to learn from. They're not for good. But you're right to add the component. What they are saying is a part of how we know it's not for good. Not just that it's a bad realm by itself.
One person I was listening to talk about this, his claim or his thought on it was, in the past, when these beings would come, they would say, I'm the God of thunder, right? And look out, so when you see thunder, you can think of me. But now, in our modern age, where technology is at the center of our lives, they say, well, we're high-tech beings from other planets.
Yeah.
Right? The same beings with a different lie come to draw you into the same deception.
Yeah.
All right,
Okay.
well, it's been an hour. We covered a lot of stuff here.
A lot we never intended to
You've
cover.
been listening to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke. If you enjoyed this podcast, found something to reconsider, or perhaps even something you've never thought about before, do us a favor and click the like button on your screen and go share it with a friend. Start a good discussion. And you've got this tagline, Truth is Freedom.
Truth is freedom.
My tagline I was thinking of was Remember to Think Again.
Remember.
All right.
Oh, that's not bad. I
right.
like that.
Either way, we'll see you next time.